Hello everyone, I'm making this video to address a certain contradiction in The Witcher 3 that tends to bother me occasionally and that my viewers talk about from time to time. Some of you may remember the video I made a long while ago about who is and who isn't a higher vampire?
Dead wrong. Thinking of lesser vampires. Alps, Ekamaras, catechans for instance.
What on earth's a catacan?
A higher vampire.
And we have a similar case here. However, instead of vampires, it's about salt. Drawing lines of salt, using it as a kind of protection against evil forces and whatnot. There are at least 3 cases that I can think of where this topic is brought up in the game by Geralt himself, and I have a hard time making sense of it all. One such case is during the quest where you speak to Roach in Blood and Wine. My previous video revolved around it. The quest can be started by visiting the old hermit's house over here at any point throughout the expansion. As you do the quest, you'll discover that she is being tormented by a peculiar type of spirit, and at the end, one of your available choices allows you to fight and even defeat the spirit, but it remains unclear whether you were able to banish it permanently. Then, upon returning to the woman, Geralt will advise her to draw salt in front of her house as a means of keeping the spirit at bay.
Don't want to forgive him? Don't have to. But if that's the case, draw salt lines along your threshold, on your windowsills. Might keep him out.
The developers even made sure to add a line of salt if you decide to return to the place several days later. However, in spite of it, the woman is found dead.
Hermit's corpse. Umbra must have returned. Body's practically drained. Not a drop of blood left.
The second case I'll bring up is actually on the opposite end of the game, during the natural first chapter of the main story, revolving around the Bloody Baron in Velen. It happens soon after saving Princess, the Peller's goat, and before you deal with the cursed child by turning it into a lubberkin. So, while explaining the ritual to the drunk Baron, Geralt says that the common folk should remain home and should be told to, once again, draw salt at their thresholds.
Best do it tonight, at midnight.
Then wait here with me. Near midnight, I'll take you to where I buried her.
Get word to the common folk. Ought to stay in their homes tonight and draw a line of salt outside their doors. And try to sober up.
And as the case was in Blood and Wine, if we proceed to turn the botchling instead of killing it, we can indeed notice lines of salt drawn in front of the houses while fighting the waves of wraiths during the escort.
Damn thing's gonna bite me! Calm it down! It worked. It stopped.
Chosen a name?
No.
So think of one. It's important.
And finally, the third case where the real contradiction occurs is during one of the contracts in Novigrad. It's called Doors Slammig Shut, from the notice board in the central square, where you end up fighting a golem under a house. There are some interesting details here, have a look at this video if you haven't, but what interests us now is a certain line of Geralt's while you investigate the place, where he basically dismisses the whole salt deal as nonsense.
Scattered salt. Probably to drive ghosts away. Pointless superstition.
So, what the sandwich fuck is going on? If we look back at the vampire contradictions, we at least had a clear divide between the base game and the Blood and Wine expansion, which came out a couple of years later, so it was safe to assume that CDPR had changed their minds on certain aspects of vampire lore. But here we have Geralt recommending the usage of salt in this manner during the first chapter of the main story.
Ought to stay in their homes tonight and draw a line of salt outside their doors.
Then dismissing it as superstition around the second chapter.
Scattered salt. Pointless superstition.
And finally suggesting it again in the Blood and Wine expansion.
Draw salt lines along your threshold, on your windowsills.
So how could we explain this? Well, in the case of the Bloody Baron, I suppose we could assume that Geralt is suggesting something which doesn't work on purpose. Perhaps he realizes how dangerous and chaotic the whole ritual could be, and therefore the lines of salt simply add an extra layer of certainty that the villagers will remain inside and not dare leave their homes. That way they won't get hurt and they won't mess up with the ritual, so why not deceive them a little bit? However, this logic does not really hold well. In the case of the hermit in Blood and Wine, she won't be any safer if she does it, assuming it doesn't work, which apparently it didn't, and it simply makes Geralt look like a bit of a dick, really, basically lying to her in order to appear as though he's done his job well. And as for the comment about the salt not working during the contract, well, it's something Geralt says to himself, so it's only natural we assume he's being serious and honest about it.
Which do you belong to?
School of the Griffin.
Then why does a wolf hang from your neck?
He specifically says it about ghosts, which the botchling technically isn't, at least before it turns into a lubberkin, but the spirit in Blood and Wine sort of is. So again, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I should also point out that there is no real evidence that the lines of salt actually work. And even if we look beyond these examples and into the books, I can't recall a single instance or mention of this. In the very first story of the first book, Geralt draws the Irden sign on the lid of a coffin to keep the Striga at bay, but that is perhaps more reminiscent of drawing a crucifix or something, rather than pouring salt. Interestingly enough, in the Vesemir anime, the old Witcher actually pours some substance around the area where he also uses the Irden sign, but I don't think it was salt. Now, another thing we should mention is the general notion that peasants hold superstitions and don't really understand these things. It is rather thematic for both the games and the books that one of the great strengths of Witchers is actually their knowledge. There is simply a lot that the common people do not know when it comes to dealing with monsters and evil forces. And often that's where Witchers come in. We see this again at the very start of the books in that story I mentioned with the Striga. The opening of The Witcher 3 has Vesemir teaching Ciri how knowledge is just as important as the silver sword.
Knowledge counts as much as your silver sword.
We keep referring to our bestiary, and generally speaking, simply knowing what to do already solves half the problem. So it would make sense that the lines of salt are an actual superstition. After all, it even makes sense from a real world's perspective. If people see that salt has certain purifying and protective properties when it comes to, say, delaying a wound from getting infected or preserving your meat from rotting, perhaps people could assume that it can also preserve them from supernatural forces as well. But if salt truly doesn't work, why would Geralt suggest that, especially in the Blood and Wine example? The fact that the line of salt is added to the hermit's house at the same time as her dead body makes me think it's most likely not an oversight. Were the developers implying that Geralt was not very well familiar with this particular type of spirit, and perhaps he was guessing and made a mistake?
Draw salt lines along your threshold, on your windowsills. Might keep him out.
But then again, even if he didn't know what else to do, would he really suggest something that he knows is flat out false? I don't think so. So tell me what you make of this. Is it a peculiar, reoccurring mistake by the developers, or is there any other explanation to it? Whatever your thoughts are, I'd be curious to hear them. With that said, I believe I'm done for now. As this is my first video for 2024, I'd like to wish you all a happy and good new year. I know the last one was not the best for me, and this one also started on a sour note. A relative of mine passed away on the 1st of January, and I hope things only go up from here. So, thank you very much for watching. Special thanks to my supporters and YouTube members, and until the next video, stay tuned and be good.